There are certain days that stick out in your mind, certain times in your life which you will not soon forget. For me, it was August the 8th, 2007. It was a Wednesday, and it was a day that changed my life forever. See, up until that point, my son Owen was what I thought a typical little baby. Now, I had never had a baby before, had really only seen them in the store, and they looked nice enough. So I really wasn't sure what to be looking for, and honestly, if I probably knew more about babies, I would have known sooner there was an issue. But I didn't. The night before, we had taken Owen into the ER there at Nationwide Children's Hospital with seizures. He began during his nightly bath. I always gave him a nightly bath when I came home from Bible study. And during his nightly bath, he began to jerk. He had what's known as myoclonic seizures. They're just real quick jerks. And during the next day, we got some test results back. And I still remember this resident came in. And I don't know if you've ever been admitted to a teaching hospital, but they have what I refer to as the doctor huddle, right? You have the attending doctor that comes in first, and then you have his little fellows behind him, and then the residents, and then at the very end of the line are the guys in their short right coats, the medical students, that have to carry all the books and lug everything, right? And the doctors don't travel alone. They always have the huddle with them, right? And over the years, I've learned that whenever I see a large group of white coats coming, I get a little nervous because I don't want to hear what they're going to say. Well, this time, the doctor huddle came to the door, and the attending doctor, the head doctor, or as I like to refer to them, mom or dad, because most of the residents look like they're 12, which I've been told is a function of me getting old. The attending doctor wasn't with them. And so this resident, she began looking at the test results, and we asked her, what did they say? And she goes, he has polymicrogyria. Well, that answers it. What is that? Well, it's a migrational brain disorder. It's when the brain doesn't totally form correctly. So I asked her, well, does that mean everything's there? Oh, yeah, everything's there. It's just not in the right spot. Oh, well, that's good, right? Well, what causes that? I'll let the attending tell you. It's never good when a resident says, I'll let my attending tell you, because they want to tell you everything, right? So finally the neurologist came in, and it turns out that because of a genetic disorder called mitochondrial disease, he has polymicrogyria, along with other issues that caused his brain to be malformed. And not being a doctor, I assumed if everything was there, that's good. No, that's not good. Not only does everything have to be there, but it needs to be in this right shape, the right configuration. And so, as we were sitting in the neurologist's office there on August the 8th, 2007, and looking over MRIs and other scans, he began to explain to us the things that we could expect. And what we were told is that we shouldn't go chasing rainbows. In other words, we should just accept the fact that his life would be short, probably a couple of years, and he would have a lot of problems, and they couldn't really tell you what the problems would be now, but eventually they will become apparent. And with that, his seizures became under control, and they released us from the hospital a few days later. And I remember driving home from Children's Hospital that day, and our car was full of sorrow and grief. And as I'm driving down the road back home, I look over and I see people going about their daily lives like nothing was wrong. You know, my world was destroyed, but their world was just fine. And I have to tell you, I've noticed this since whenever I do a funeral. And usually, as the pastor, you ride up in the hearse. And it always is striking to me as we're driving from the church to the cemetery or the funeral home to the cemetery. And as the hearse passes, people going about their day, smiling and laughing and enjoying themselves. I can't wrap my mind around the fact that when I look in the rearview mirror, I see a long line of people whose world has been destroyed, people who are mourning, people whose life has changed forever. So, a couple of weeks pass after Owen's diagnosis, and my wife Anita, she cried a lot, but I was okay. Until, I said about 2 weeks later, and it was a Sunday morning, right before I left to go preach, and all of a sudden it hit me. It hit me that, he was more than likely never going to say Daddy. He very well may never know who I even was. I was never going to get to teach him to tie a tie or go and help him join Cub Scouts or go to parent-teacher conferences or all of the things that I had expected to do as a parent. And so I had this little breakdown. And then I was okay. And then I had to go preach. And I don't quite remember what it was, but I do remember it was a relatively happy kind of topic. And so I put my smile on and I preached about the love of God. My friends, as Christians, none of us are immune from grief. What's grief? Simply put, grief is an emotional reaction to loss. It's an emotional reaction to loss. And there are all kinds of losses that you and I and our loved ones can have. The most common is, of course, grief over the loss of a loved one. But grief can also come from the diagnosis of a severe or terminal illness, or the end of a relationship, including divorce or separation. Sometimes I forget that the person who is getting divorced is grieving. The loss of a job or the loss of a dream. Or a big one that I've noticed lately, the loss of independence. My friends, it can be quite painful to lose your independence, to no longer be able to take care of yourself or live in your own home or to drive your own car. These are just a few of the things that cause us to grieve, that cause us to have that deep emotional sorrow that comes from a significant loss in our lives. Grief is powerful. Grief is at times all-consuming. It is both universal and very personal. What I mean by that is it's universal in that we're all going to suffer grief at some point in our lives because we're all going to experience some sort of significant loss in our lives. There's no escaping that. But it's personal in the fact that we all grieve a little bit differently. I'm reminded of a story that took place in the first church that I ever served. When I first got there was a man by the name of Dale. And Dale's wife had passed away, a couple of months before I arrived on the scene. And he was just a great guy. And he was really good friends with Edna. He and Edna had been friends for years. Their spouses were friends, and they did a couple things together. Edna's husband had died several years earlier, and she helped Dale through his time of losing his wife. And then one day I got the gossip. Dale and Edna were sitting next to each other in church. And then I got the gossip. They went on a date. I got to tell you, dealing with senior citizens is a lot like dealing with high school kids. It really is. It was so cute. I expected somebody to write a note, do you like me, yes or no? I mean, it was so cute. And so they started dating. And finally, they decided they were going to get married. And it was about a year since Dale's wife had died. And his children were having a problem with it. Because, see, Dale had moved to a point in his grief where he was ready to move on and to get married. But his children had not, and they were not at all going to accept their dad with another woman. And it took quite a bit of work and talking it out and understanding that different people grieve at different times in different ways. My friends, everyone grieves in their own way. There isn't a proper way, or let me say this, there isn't a bad way of grieving. Grieving is personal, and we have to understand that our friends, our neighbors, our loved ones, even ourselves may not experience grief the same way as somebody else. And we need to give them the grace to be who they are in their pain and in their sorrow. My friends, each of us is going to grieve because as Christians, we are not immune to suffering. I wish I could stand up here and tell you today that because you have a relationship with Jesus Christ, you are never going to suffer. Nothing bad is ever going to happen to you. You're never going to lose your job. You're never going to run into financial issues. You're never going to have a fight with your spouse. Your kids are going to grow up beautiful, smart, and will take care of you the way you deserve in your old age. And no one will ever die. That's not true. As Christians, we are not immune from suffering. Jesus never said that we are immune from suffering. But what we do have as Christians is hope. See, that's what's different between being a Christian and having a faith in Jesus and not. When we grieve, we have a hope in Jesus Christ. I want to read you a little something here. It comes from 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 through 18. Apostle Paul wrote this to a church who was suffering. He wrote this. He said, "Brothers and sisters, we want you to know about the people who have died so that you won't mourn like others who don't have any hope. Since we believe that Jesus died and rose, so we also believe that God will bring with him those who have died in Jesus." What we are saying is a message from the Lord. We who are alive and still around at the Lord's coming definitely won't go ahead of those who have died. This is because the Lord himself will come down from heaven with the signal of a shout by the head angel and a blast of God's trumpet. First, those who are dead in Christ will rise. Then we who are living and still around will be taken up together with them in the clouds to meet with the Lord in the air. That way, we will always be with the Lord. So encourage each other with these words. I love that verse. Because in that verse, we of course find out the truth that we have already talked about, that the truth that we're all going to suffer at some point. We're all going to grieve a loss, but we have hope. Listen to what Paul says. He says, "Brothers and sisters, we want you to know about people who have died so that you do not mourn like others who don't have any hope." So where does our hope come from in Christ? It comes first and foremost from his death and resurrection. We know that because of his death and resurrection, those who have died will be with him in eternity. We have hope of everlasting life. Also, our hope comes from being a community of believers. My friends, God will use us to bring hope and comfort and peace to those who are in grief and mourning. Now, you might be saying, "Pastor Rick, I don't know how that's going to be. I'm not a grief counselor. I'm not good in these things." That's okay. Either am I. And we're all going to get through this together. Because God is in charge. And he knows what people need. And God will help you if you only open yourself up to him, to be used as an instrument of grace. And sometimes that instrument of grace is simply someone to talk to. About the same time that I married Dale and Edna, I also had a woman who went to my church. She lived alone, never married, often talked about the love of her life that she lost for her career. She lived with her sister and her dog. Right before I got there, her sister died. Shortly after I got there, her dog died. And she was all alone. And she was depressed. And she stopped eating. And she ended up going to an assisted care center. And I would go visit Phyllis because she wanted me to come visit her. The problem is, Phyllis didn't listen to the TV, didn't turn on the radio, didn't read, didn't talk. She could talk, she could do all of this, but she wouldn't. So she would answer the door, she would say, "Hi, Pastor Rick, I'm glad you're here." She would then sit down in the chair across from me and just stare. Now, that's uncomfortable. And so for the first few visits, what I did is I did basically my best Jay Leno monologue, right? Because if she's not going to talk, I'll talk for both of us. I got that covered. And I would do this conversation, then I would answer the questions, and that's very tiring. And soon I found out that she was perfectly okay if I came and we sat in silence for an hour. Because it wasn't what I said that mattered, it was my presence. My friends, sometimes God simply wants you to be present in someone's life, someone who is going through a divorce, someone who is ill or has a loved one who is seriously ill, or someone who has recently lost a loved one. Sometimes they just need someone to listen to them, someone to be with them, someone to say, "I'm here for you." Because no words are going to make it better, but your presence and your caring can. My friends, our hope is in Jesus. Verse 17 says this. It says, "We will always be with the Lord." My friends, it doesn't matter what valley of despair you are going through this day, Jesus is with you, and Jesus understands. One of my favorite verses of the Bible is also the shortest verse of the Bible. Any of you know what the shortest verse of the New Testament is? Jesus wept. Right? Jesus wept over the death of his friend Lazarus. He wept over the sorrow of his friends, Mary and Martha. He wept. He weeps with you. Never forget that Jesus is with you. Never forget that you have people here who love you. And never forget that you might be the answer to someone's prayer for help. My friends, grief is normal. Grief is a fact of life.